This is Dateline News and Conversation. My guest tonight needs no introduction. Scott Ritter, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Well, you went to the Rage Against the Machine rally protest in New York. You weren't able to give your speech to the crowd on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but you streamed it. And this was one of the most incredible speeches I've ever heard. I'd like you to comment on a couple of things, and then I'm going to play that entire speech, which is 16 minutes. So you basically made a point of the real danger from the military-industrial congressional media complex is nuclear war. You're an expert on nuclear weapons, nuclear treaties, disarmament. You are quite passionate about that. I'd like you to comment on Oppenheimer's famous quote, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Just give me in your own words, what was going through your mind? I mean, to me, you scared the bejesus. You should have scared the bejesus out of people, woken them up.
Well, that was the goal. I mean, and it's not meant to be frivolous. I don't believe in hyping up something that isn't a threat. The background is I had done a presentation in New York City on my book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. And, that presentation is not just about the history of the INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and my role in that, but also a template of hope. We've had this discussion before, and I feel that as bad as things are today between the United States and Russia, that experience of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty provides, an example of how we can get out of this, to re-embrace arms control. And it's not just to re-embrace arms control as an academic exercise. When I tell people, and I don't mean this facetiously, I mean in all sincerity, when you see me, shake my damn hand, because I saved your life, me and the other inspectors, American and Soviet alike. If we hadn't implemented successfully the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the likelihood of a nuclear conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union is sky high. And given the fact that we're all human, we make mistakes, we have misjudgments. You don't make mistakes in nuclear war. If there's an error of judgment, if you detect an attack that's not an attack and you launch your weapons, we're all dead anyways. And by removing intermediate nuclear forces from the table, we created a window of opportunity that I believe saved everybody's life. And I highlight in the speech an incident in June of 1995 when a Norwegian rocket was launched, misinterpreted as a Trident submarine attack, and Boris Yeltsin had the nuclear football in front of him, and he was told to enter the launch codes because the Americans have attacked. Now, had there not been an intermediate nuclear forces treaty, there would have been Pershing 2 missiles 7 minutes away from Moscow. That means you have less than 7 minutes to make a decision, which means the only decision is to push the button. But because we took those weapons off the table, there was more time to determine that it was a mistake, an error, and there was no Russian attack, which means the United States wouldn't have retaliated, which means we all get to live today. So shake my hand, buy me a beer, and do that for everybody who was involved in this treaty. But now the treaty's gone, and arms control is gone, and yet here we are back in the same situation. So the purpose of the speech was to put the fear of God into people, and people who attended this presentation in New York City liked what they heard. They say, "Hey, could you do a version of that at the Rage Against the War Machine rally?" And I agreed to. And then for a variety of reasons, apparently my politics aren't pure enough and my background's not pristine enough. I was disinvited, but I went ahead and wrote the speech anyways, and I delivered it. And I streamed it because I think it's a message that needs to be heard, that if we don't re-engage on arms control, if we don't try to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, there will be no tomorrow, no matter what you believe, whether you're pro-gun, anti-gun, pro-life, pro-abortion, pro you know, get rid of climate change, whatever issue you have. And I'm not denigrating any of these issues. They're all important issues. They simply won't matter because there won't be a world where these issues have relevance. The world will be destroyed. Humanity will be gone. The biggest threat to humankind is nuclear weapons in the hands of the United States and Russia today, and tensions are very high. And if we don't find a way to A, reduce the tensions, and B, reintroduce meaningful arms control, this is all, we're wasting our time. We might as well go ahead and dig the grave, put a bullet in our head and jump in. It'll be easier that way. And I'm being dead serious because there will be a nuclear war if we don't re-engage on arms control. And one of the biggest impediments to re-engaging is here in the United States, the disease of Russophobia. The fact is we can't even consider having that dialogue with the Russians. When you look back on what we did with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, it wasn't easy. It was one of the hardest things I've ever been involved in. We had politicians that didn't want it to happen. We had, cold warriors that didn't want it to happen. And then just human irregularities. The fact is we were trying to get two societies that weren't used to working together to try and cooperate on something. There wasn't a lot of trust there. We solved it by talking to each other. The conversations, the discussions, the debates, the dialogue from the presidential level all the way down to the inspector on the ground made this treaty succeed. And we talked to each other because we respected each other, and we respected each other because we trusted one another, and we trusted one another because there was a mutual recognition that we were humans on a planet occupying the same space. And if we didn't cooperate with each other, we were all going to die. And so we fixed it. We made it happen. And today we're not talking. Why? Because there's ignorance out there. We're ignorant about Russia. We don't know anything about Russia. And from that ignorance comes fear. And that fear allows us to believe anything we're told by the government and the media about Russia and assume that it's bad. That has to come to an end. So my goal in giving this speech was to begin a process of re-embracing, re-endorsing arms control, but also beginning a journey of rebuilding trust between the United States and Russia. And I'm not talking about at the government level. That's their business. I'm talking about at the human level, the people level, you, me, people watching. We have to learn to talk to one another. We have to learn to trust one another. We have to learn to respect one another as humans. Americans need to understand that Russians over there have the same fears, have the same joys. They love, they hate, they appreciate children like we do, grandchildren. They want to live. They cry, they laugh, they tell jokes. Some good, some bad. It doesn't matter. They're as human as we are. And therefore, there's no reason for us to have this wall of silence between us. And if we can begin talking, guess what? We're the adults in the room now. And we set the example that our elected officials have to follow. Right now, our officials get away with whatever they want because we don't say anything because we're dumbed down by Russophobia, by ignorance, by the fear generated by that. So part of the speech was also about beginning a process of bringing Russians and Americans back together at the most basic level, person to person, man to man, woman to woman, and begin dialogue, begin talking with each other. Because the Russians right now, they don't like us too much, and there's a reason for that. They don't trust us. They think we violated every treaty, and they have a reason to believe that too, but that's our government's problem. But they've allowed their anger and their frustration with the American government to come down and impact how they feel about the American people as well. So this is a two-way street. This is about America needing to overcome Russophobia, but it's also about the Russians being willing to give the American people a chance to win their trust back. And I firmly believe that if we can just sit down and talk as people, work things out like we did in the past, we can work through this and we can create an environment that enables our governments to sit down at the table. Trust but verify was that thing from the INF treaty, Ronald Reagan. Dora no proveri. Probably butchered that, but I'm a Marine, so I'm allowed to. But trust but verify. Verification is the business of government. It's not my job. It's not the Russian citizens' job to tell our respective governments what kind of treaty to make. They will make the right kind of treaty to sit down. They will determine, what's going to be covered, what's not going to be covered, how they're going to inspect, how they're not going to inspect, et cetera, et cetera. Technical stuff. The trust part's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to create an environment of trust. And if we can begin trusting one another, if we can begin working together, then our governments now are empowered to have that conversation about verification. Trust, but verify. Two components. Our component is the trust component, and that's what I'm trying to work on.
Thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to address you today. I speak to you from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a place of history filled with gravitas worthy of the task we have set for ourselves at this time in our collective history. To stand up, no, to rage against a war machine that has perverted the very definition of what it means to be an American. We stand here today at the very nexus of this war machine. To our right, just over the Potomac River, lies the Pentagon, a structure built at a time when America called upon its collective might to defeat the scourge of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, but which has since then morphed into the very symbol of evil itself, a breeding ground for weapons and plans that are used by the other partners in what has become known as the military-industrial complex, to spread malfeasance around a world we once protected, but now enslaved through a process of perpetual conflict used to sustain the American war machine. And who are these other partners? Before us, past the monument to our founding father, George Washington, stands the Capitol of the United States, where the people's representatives fund in great secrecy the nefarious schemes cooked up in the bowels of the Pentagon. And to our left stands the White House, the seat of executive authority, where individuals we invest with singular authority betray the trust of those who put them there by conceiving and implementing policies designed to further the Pentagon's war efforts. This is the very nexus of evil, an unholy trinity of terroristic madness, which some 61 years ago, Dwight D. Eisenhower, an American warrior turned political leader, warned the American people about, cautioning that, quote, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, unquote. In the history of the United States that has transpired since that speech, no truer words have been spoken by an American president, and no greater wisdom has been disregarded by those whom Eisenhower entrusted with that message. We, the people of the United States. We stand here today to announce to this terrible trinity, to this military-industrial complex, this war machine, that we hear you now, President Eisenhower. We hear you, and we will act on your warning to bring this nexus of un-American conspiracy to an end. Of all the weapons produced by the military-industrial complex, of all the evil schemes hatched in the minds of the so-called national security experts, most of whom are unelected by and unknown to we, the American people, none reek of madness more than nuclear weapons. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, the father of the American atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, said at the time of the first American nuclear test. Destroyer of worlds. This is the ever-present reality that we all live in today, that from this nexus of evil we call the military-industrial complex comes the very weapons necessary to bring the words of the Hindu sacred text that Oppenheimer quoted, the Bhagavad Gita, to life, and in doing so, bring about our collective deaths. Most Americans, including many of you assembled here today, live in blissful ignorance of just how close the world has come to being destroyed by Oppenheimer's progeny. On 26 September 1983, a Soviet officer, Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, was on duty at a nuclear early warning station when the system reported that 5 nuclear-armed missiles had been launched from the United States. Colonel Petrov disregarded protocol requiring him to report this detection as a factual launch, an act that would have triggered a Soviet response, and in doing so brought precious time for the error to be identified and nuclear war averted. In November 1983, the United States and NATO carried out a command post exercise codenamed Able Archer 83, which tested the launch control procedures for the release of NATO nuclear weapons against Soviet and Warsaw Pact targets. The Soviets, believing this exercise to be a cover for a first strike, placed its nuclear forces on high alert. Later, the CIA assessed that the Able Archer 83 exercise brought the US and Soviets closer to nuclear conflict than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And on January 25, 1995, the Soviets detected the launch of a Norwegian atmospheric test rocket that mimicked the track of a US Navy Trident submarine-launched nuclear weapon. Fearing a high-altitude nuclear attack that would blind Russian radar, Russian nuclear forces went on high alert, and the nuclear briefcase was delivered to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who had to make a split-second decision on whether to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike against the United States. These three incidents underscore the razor's edge we all walk daily when it comes to living in a world where nuclear weapons exist. One mistake, one error, one misjudgment, and the Bhagavad Gita becomes reality. We were saved from the inevitability of our collective demise by one thing and one thing only: arms control. The deployment into Europe by both the United States and Soviet Union of intermediate-range nuclear-armed missiles in the 1980s only increased the possibility of a mistake or misunderstanding that could trigger nuclear conflict. The fact that these weapons could reach their respective target in 5 minutes or less, once launched, meant that the 30 to 40-minute buffer of time that existed regarding the use of strategic nuclear forces was no longer there. To put it more starkly, if it were not for the implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1988 that eliminated these new and dangerous weapons, the January 25, 1995 atmospheric rocket incident would more than likely resulted in a general nuclear war, simply for the fact that Boris Yeltsin would not have been denied the luxury of time to decide whether or not to launch his missiles. Everyone standing here today should reflect on this statement and say a quiet word of thanks to those men and women, American and Soviet alike, who made the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty a reality and, in doing so, literally saved the world from nuclear destruction. Arms control, however, is no longer part of the US-Russian dialogue. The American war machine has conspired to denigrate the notion of mutually beneficial disarmament in the minds of the American public, instead seeking to use arms control as a mechanism to achieve unilateral strategic advantage. When an arms control treaty becomes inconvenient to the objective of American global domination, then the war machine simply quits. America's record in this regard is damnable. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, all relegated to the trash bin of history in the cause of seeking unilateral advantage for the American war machine. In a world without arms control, we will once again be confronted with a renewed arms race where each side develops weapons that protect nothing while threatening everything. Without arms control, we will return to a time where living on the edge of the abyss of imminent nuclear annihilation was the norm, not the exception. The war machine has allowed the principal position of peaceful coexistence regulated by mutually beneficial treaties governed by the time-tested maxim of trust but verify to be replaced by a new posture defined by a war machine that uses nuclear weapons, that uses the nuclear weapon establishment and the billions of dollars it costs to maintain it annually as a means of buying off politicians at the expense of the population our government is sworn to protect. This is the final corruption of the military-industrial complex. Its conversion to the military-industrial congressional complex, where we, the people, are excluded from every consideration, whether it be funding or consequence. The key to sustaining this inherently un-American mechanism is the ability of the military-industrial congressional complex, the war machine, to generate fear amongst the American people derived from ignorance of the true nature of the threat or threats these nuclear weapons are designed to address. In the case of US-Russian relations, this fear is produced by systemic Russophobia imposed on the American public by a war machine and its compliant minions in the mainstream media. Left to its own device, the collusion between government and media will only further reinforce ignorance-based fear through a process of dehumanizing Russia and the Russian people in the eyes of the American public. until we have become desensitized to the lies and distortions, accepting at face value anything negative said about Russia. It is here in such a situation that we can turn to Scripture, John 8:32, for some guidance. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But what truth? The truth is told by the government, as promulgated by the mainstream media? That is no truth, but rather a bodyguard of lies constructed on behalf of a war machine that wants every American to accept without question the legitimacy of weapons that are the only known utility of which is the destruction of all mankind. Some 60 years ago, on these very steps, in this very place, a man of peace gave a speech that captured the imagination of the nation and the world, searing into our collective hearts and minds the word, "I have a dream." Dr. Martin Luther King's historic address confronted America's sordid history of slavery and the inhumanity and injustice of racial segregation. In it, he dreamed, quote, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. These words resonated in the context of America's desperate internal struggle with the legacy of slavery and racial injustice. But these words apply equally, especially when taken in the context that we are all God's children, black, white, rich, poor, American, Russian. You see, I too have a dream that the audience gathered here today can find a way to overcome the ignorance-based fears generated by the disease of Russophobia, to open our minds and our hearts to accept the Russian people as fellow human beings deserving of the same compassion and consideration as our fellow Americans, as all humankind. I too have a dream that we, the people of the United States of America, can unite in common cause with the Russian people to build bridges of peace that facilitate an exchange of ideas, open minds closed by the hate-filled rhetoric of Russophobia that is promulgated by the war machine and its allies, and allow the love we have for ourselves to manifest itself into love and respect for our fellow man, especially those who live in Russia. Newton's third law, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, applies to the human condition every bit as much as it applies to the physical world. Love thy neighbor as thyself is applicable to all humanity. I too have a dream that by overcoming the hate generated by systemic Russophobia, we can work with our fellow human beings in Russia to create communities of compassion that, when united, make a world filled with nuclear weapons undesirable and policies built on the principles of mutually beneficial arms control second nature. I too have a dream that one day, whether on the red hills of Georgia or the black soil of the Kuban, the sons and daughters of the men and women who today operate the Russian and American nuclear arsenals will be able, to quote Dr. King, to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. This is not an impossible dream. I have lived it. I once was corrupted by the hatred that comes from fear generated by the ignorance about the reality of those whom I was trained to kill. But then I embarked on a remarkable journey of discovery, facilitated by the implementation of the very same Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that ended up saving humanity from nuclear annihilation, where I came to know the Russian people not as enemy, but as friend, not as opponent, but colleague, as fellow human beings capable of the same emotions as myself, imbued with the same human desire to build a better world for themselves and their loved ones, a world free of the tyranny of nuclear weapons. I too have a dream that the people gathered here today will join me on a new journey of discovery, one that tears down the walls of ignorance and fear constructed by the war machine, walls designed to separate us from our fellow human beings in Russia, and instead build bridges that connect us to those we have been conditioned to hate, but now, for the sake of ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren, must learn to love. This will not be an easy journey, but is one worth taking. This is my journey, your journey, our journey, where we will embark literally down the road less traveled. And yes, it will be the one that will make all the difference. It will take us, as Dr. King once cried out from these very steps, to the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, the mighty mountains of New York, the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, the curvaceous slopes of California, to every hill and every molehill of Mississippi. This is an American journey, a journey of Americans united in the cause of peace and justice in a world free from the tyranny of nuclear weapons. Our numbers will grow from 2,000 to 20,000, from 20,000 to 100,000, and from 100,000 to 1 million or more. And who knows, maybe in June of 2024, on the anniversary of the 1982 gathering of 1 million people in New York City's Central Park, where they rallied in favor of nuclear disarmament and an end to the nuclear arms race, we can come together and send a similar message to the war machine. 1 million people or more demanding that their government act in a manner that preserves and protects the lives and future of all Americans, of all humanity. The 1982 rally set in motion events that led to the implementation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, a treaty that literally saved the world from nuclear destruction. I too have a dream that together we can harness the same energy, the same vision, the same passion as those who have gone before us and create a movement of people united in the principles of peace that will lead to a future arms control agreement between the United States and Russia that will preserve our collective futures. There will be forces that will try to disrupt us, to dissuade us, to destroy us. We cannot allow ourselves to be intimidated. We must not go gently into that good night, but instead rage against the dying of the light. Rage against the war machine. Rage, so that together we may breathe life into the words of President Lincoln inscribed on the memorial behind me, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Let us get to work. Thank you.
To all units, proceed to your post assignments. All units, proceed to your post assignments.
I sent you an article by Sergei Kurganyan, a very well-known and respected social scientist, psychologist. I don't know if he's a politician. He wrote this article, and he said he discovered 4 or 5 frightening things about the Russian special military operation. The first thing he said was Russia was unprepared for a medium-sized positional war. I have no idea what that meant. What does that mean?
Well, I think what he's talking about is the war that's being fought right now. It's not World War II. Nations mobilized against nations, total war. But it's not a tiny regional conflict either, like Syria. It's something in between where you have major armies fighting each other, but not in large wars of maneuver, but rather this positional warfare, this war of attrition where the Ukrainians are dug in, the Russians are dug in. The Russians don't want to launch expensive assaults to break through the lines, so they begin the process of blowing them up with artillery, closing in, but the Ukrainians are firing artillery back, and there's heavy casualties on both sides. That's what he's talking about. So that's what I believe he's talking about.
Okay. The other thing he said, the outstanding number of frauds in the Army. I think I know what that means, Scott, but what do you think that means?
Look, Russia inherited a military that was broken. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Army went through a very difficult period in transitioning not just to the Russian Federation Army, but the different component parts. So there was negotiations taking place on what goes where, who does what. You went from a singular institution to one that was being broken up. And there was no money. So whatever is left for the Russians, it was underfunded. Then you had the war in Chechnya that didn't go well. You had morale issues. And then you had the lengthy process of trying to rebuild it in an environment where, I mean, when we say rebuild, we're talking about money. We're talking about significant amounts of money that are going into defense industries and other institutions to rebuild the military. But Russia at that time was a nation whose economy was corrupted by oligarchs, and there was a get rich quick type mentality that bled over into the military, and it infected the military at pretty much every level. And it's something that, as Russia has progressed out of the 90s, the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin, has taken a very harsh position on corruption, on the influence of the oligarchs. And it's, he's tried to weed it out of civilian life, the civilian economy. But the defense is, it's a more insular thing. And in the military, you're sort of separate from the civilians. So you're relying on the military to clean itself. And there is cleaning going on. It's not a total loss, but if you don't think that some of that residual corruption, carried over to the present, especially when the Russian military hasn't been fundamentally tested, it's been going through this growth period. They've had sharp conflicts. There was a period in Chechnya. They had the brief war with Georgia. They've been in Syria, and they've been doing some small operations here and there, but they haven't been tested in terms of a systemic fashion. And so certainly when this war began and suddenly the military was being called upon to function, you have 3 decades of atrophied muscles, so to speak, combined with residual corruption, because corrupt officers in the 1990s who aren't weeded out become corrupt officers in 2022. There's no doubt about that. And so there was a modicum of that. But I think one of the great things about the special military operation is that it exposed this. Because of the contingencies of war, Russia has been successful in identifying the issues and rectifying the issues. And I think the Russian military today is in a far stronger position than it was. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that a lot of this criticism about the Russian military, performance-wise, corruption-wise, comes from a cadre of people who fought in 2014, 2015 in the Donbass. And they have rather extremist positions vis-a-vis what should be happening there. They feel ownership for this struggle because they were there at the beginning. There's a lot of resentment in them for being abandoned for 8 years in their opinion, and they also believe that they know it all. They're the ones with the solution, and so now Russia's engaged, and you have people who weren't involved for the last 8 years coming in and taking charge, and maybe not performing to the way they wanted, maybe not executing the strategy they wanted. So they interpret the fact that other people come in with a different vision as representing incompetence and corruption, et cetera. So I would also take a lot of the allegations of corruption and incompetence with a heavy grain of salt, because there's people working in Moscow who have a different vision of the overall strategic picture than a bunch of guys who are down in the weeds in the Donbass who think they know everything.
Another point that Kurganyan made was the number of countries like China, India, and the United Arab Emirates who are not sanctioning Russia. They're calling for peace, but he said they're kind of wriggling. What are your thoughts on especially China? China come out very forcefully recently in the white paper that they wrote. Their secretaries of foreign affairs and defense have really been lambasting the United States very directly. What are your thoughts on China? And they've been accused of maybe shipping lethal weapons to Russia. And I say, well, what the heck is wrong with that? Your thoughts?
Look, first of all, the issue of one nation supplying other nations weapons is between those two nations. It's nobody else's business. And for the West to suddenly take a principled position on China providing weapons to Russia while they're pouring $113 billion of military aid and other financial assistance to Ukraine it just shows hypocrisy, and it's ludicrous. I don't know what Russia's doing. You and I had this conversation about the drones early on, and I took the position that I didn't see why Russia would need Iranian drones. It turned out that Russians had a deficiency in drone technology, doctrine, and that the Iranian drones were in fact necessary, and therefore they purchased them. That's their business. I personally don't see how Russia would allow China to have their hand on the throttle of this war. And what I mean by the throttle is the key driving factor. One of the key driving factors in this war is artillery ammunition, the availability of the ammunition. The side that has the most ammunition applied to the most tubes tends to do the most damage, tends to prevail on the battlefield. And right now that's advantage Russia. But the implication is if they need Chinese ammunition, there's a deficiency of Russian ammunition. I don't accept that. I believe Russia is actually has a defense industry that's mobilized and is producing sufficient ammunition to meet the needs. But that's an outside opinion. I don't know that for a fact. So let's hypothetically say that Russia doesn't have enough ammunition. By bringing China into the picture, what you've allowed now is China gets to dictate the pace of your operations. Now, that's great if China's your friend and says unlimited ammunition, all you need, et cetera. But if China gets in a position where suddenly Taiwan, the U.S. puts something on the table and it's looking attractive to China, but the U.S. says, slow it down a little bit. Suddenly the train might be late. The factory might shut down. And China's throttling down the ammunition at a time when Russia might need it. And now China's in control of a Russian operation that's essential for Russian national security. So I just think it's a silly thing. But again, I don't know what's going on in Russia. I don't know the calculations. I just happen to believe that it's better for the Russians to double their ammunition production rate by building new factories in Russia so that they're in control of the situation rather than delegating control of the throttle to a third party, even if it's China who is saying the right things in terms of relationships between the collective West and Russia and China, but hasn't jumped on board. I mean, they're wearing a shirt that says Team Russia, but they haven't come on over and sat down on the bench. They're not going in the locker with Russia for their own reasons. And one of the main reasons is that China has traditionally embraced a Westphalian principle when it comes to respecting the sovereignty of other nations, and they believe that the Russian invasion of Ukraine violates that principle, and so they've been hesitant to endorse it. But also, what's happening now is, and we see with the rhetoric of the Chinese, they're accepting the reality of this war's transition from a Russian versus Ukraine conflict to a Russian versus the collective West conflict, and so now they're looking at it and they're saying, no, now we're on Team Russia when it comes to Russia versus the collective West. And I see that transition being made right now. And but I'm hesitant to embrace without further evidence the idea that China is going to be providing Russia with lethal assistance, artillery ammunition, things of that nature. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't see Russia needing it. I don't see Russia wanting it, and I don't see Russia giving control of the throttle of war, the throttle of victory to China.
Yeah. Do you think China realizes that they are next?
Oh, they know that. I mean, China's fully cognizant of that. That's why, look, there's a diplomatic dance taking place right now. China has a very principled position that it's held for many, many decades, and they're not going to abandon it because that position defines the stance they've taken on Taiwan. So if they accept, intervention into the sovereign, affairs of other states, then they legitimize America's interest in Taiwan. So China can't do that. So they have to maintain this principled stance. But they've been working very hard with Russia on allowing Russia to pivot economically, to develop new markets. They've placed diplomatic pressures on the developing world to create markets, not to sanction Russia. So I think the Chinese have been very, very good friends. It's not the kind of friendship that maybe some people want where you have to, fly the Russian flag and sing Russian songs and parade. It's quiet friendship. It's friendship that matters, friendship that, matters most right now. Russia doesn't need China to sit there and be your cheerleader for this conflict. Russia doesn't need that. First of all, what would it change? Nothing. What Russia needs is China to be doing exactly what it's doing, being there economically, being there diplomatically, and just being there. So I don't criticize China. I don't criticize India. I don't criticize any nation that has, not embraced or not succumbed to the pressure of sanctions. This war has put everybody in a very, very difficult position. Ask the Russian people themselves. How many Russian people are truly, when this thing started, yeah, baby, let's go into Ukraine? I think that there was a lot of Russian people going, I'm not comfortable with this. I got a gut problem with this. Well, you know what? If the average Russian has a gut problem, what do you think the rest of the world's doing? War is a horrible thing. Nobody wants a war. And the nuances of the Russian justification of this war, which I actually support, I think the Russians have articulated a cognizable case under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter for preemptive collective self-defense. But me just saying that alone confuses people, let alone digging into the details of it. So please forgive people and nations when they go, I don't know, man, this is tough. This is a tough one, especially a war that has not ended the way Russia thought it would. Now we know what Russia wanted on phase one. And this is another reason why I take a departure with the gentleman's conclusion, because he's concluding that this war inevitably was going to be a medium-sized war of attrition. That's not what Russia wanted. The reason why Russia went in with a special military operation the way they did, we now know, is because they were trying to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table. 3 meetings in Gomel, Belarus, that led to a potential 4th meeting in Istanbul, where a finalized treaty was ready for signature that would have ended this conflict. That was the sole purpose of the people were like, why did they steamroll him? Why did they do that? I was the same way. You know that. We had this conversation. I'm like, bring it on doctrinally, baby. Roll over them, kill them all, sort the bodies out later. And the Russians are going, that ain't our strategy, you see, because we don't want war. Wow, imagine that. The Russians don't want war. The Russians wanted peace, but they were blocked every step of the way by, Poroshenko, by Merkel, by Hollande, who said Minsk is a sham. Well, gosh, if Putin invested everything into making Minsk a reality, when the people he's supposed to be negotiating with are lying to him the whole time, you can't blame Russia for that. And then when Russia said, okay, since Minsk is a sham, what if we put forward new treaty vehicles, which they did in December 17th of 2021, the NATO treaty, the United States treaty, they said, we can still prevent a war if you accept this new European security framework we're talking about. You don't even have to accept the whole thing. All we want you to do is read it and then seriously sit down and talk with us about this. And then we don't have to have a war. But if you ignore us, then there will be a military technical solution. And the military technical solution was a special military operation specifically designed to get Zelensky's government to the negotiating table. Ask yourself the following question. If Russia was at war with Ukraine, why is Zelensky alive? Why is Zelensky able to make phone calls? Why is Zelensky able to do video conferencing? Why is Zelensky able to work from a bunker in the Ministry of Defense? If this was a war, none of that infrastructure would exist. They would all be dead or scattered. It's not a war. Russia deliberately allowed the Ukrainian government to exist, to function, to engage in the diplomacy necessary for other nations to talk to Ukraine about taking negotiations seriously. And so Russia enabled a peaceful outcome. If the Russian plan had succeeded and it was on the verge of succeeding, this war would have been over on April 1st. This war would have been over on April 1st. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians would be alive today. $1 trillion of Ukrainian infrastructure would still be functioning. Tens of millions of Ukrainian civilians would be in their home, jobs, their kids going to school. And it's not Russia's fault that didn't happen. But phase one was that. So, hey, excuse me, Mr. Professor, you, the gentleman who wrote the paper, it wasn't Russia's goal to go into a medium-sized war of attrition. That's what they inherited after the West rejected the peace opportunity that Russia made possible by phase one of their special military operation.
So, Scott, my last question.
Before I have a heart attack?
Where is Russia at today? Everybody seems, was waiting for this big offensive on the anniversary. It hasn't happened. In your opinion, is this another phase in the war? What is, people want to hear this from you. What do you think Russia's strategy is now?
Well, I mean, you've spoken to Ray McGovern. You know Ray McGovern. old Soviet analyst from the CIA. And Ray has opened my eyes on a number of things because he's a guy that's been there, done that. And he taught me a while back that the best way to figure out what somebody's doing is to listen to them. You know, Vladimir Putin gave a speech on February 21st, it's sort of the State of the Nation address to the Federal Assembly. And if you listen to what it's, because a lot of people, I don't understand the impatience of people. They wanted him to come out and basically put up a map and draw a big arrow on it saying, I'm ordering the Russian army to march on Kiev and it's all going to be over today. And when he didn't do that, they went, man, that's under, what the hell's going on? I'm disappointed in Putin. Listen to what he's saying, guys, because he told you exactly what's going to happen. He said, first of all, if you listen to the language, he likened the present conflict to the Great Patriotic War. He kept alluding to that. He talked about the cost that's been paid by the nation, and that the veterans and their families must be taken care of in a similar fashion to those who had gone before them. So he knows the nation's at war. He's also talked about the fact that defense industry is on a war footing, producing the sufficient resources necessary for this conflict. He knows there's a war. Well, then why isn't he drawing a big arrow to Kiev? Listen to what he said, guys. It's never been the mission of the special military operation to draw a big arrow to Kiev. He's focused on improving the economic and social lives of the population of Novorossiya and Donbass. Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That's what he's doing. And he's going to secure them by pushing the Ukrainian forces back to the range of the weapon systems provided by NATO, which in this case means the HIMARS with the small bomb rocket, which means 150 kilometers. For all you people that are looking for big arrows, he just drew a lot of big arrows, guys. I mean, it's a simple exercise. Get one of those compasses, you know, that you used to use as a kid, protractor set and all that kind of stuff. Put the needle on the border of Novorossiya, the far western border, go to a scale, figure out what 150 kilometers is, and then just start drawing range circles, and you'll see what that means. Oh, gosh, does that mean Odessa is what that's? Yes, it is. Is Kharkov in there? Oh, yes, it is. Dnipropetrovsk? Yeah. Guys, Vladimir Putin just told you what's going to happen. Okay, it's the biggest arrow game of them all. He's just not crude and has to draw it for you. You just have to listen to what he's saying. Russia's at war. Defense industry's cooking. The people that he's responsible for protecting will be protected. And those who are threatening them will be pushed back to the distance, the maximum distance of the weapons provided, which is 150 kilometers right now for the HIMARS. Congratulations, Ukraine, by the way, for accepting that weapon. It didn't change the outcome on the battlefield. All it did is guarantee that your nation will be further fractured. Now, what he didn't say is what's going to happen when you take Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk. But we know what's going to happen because he's already told us. Listen to the president. His responsibility is to the Russian nation. And the Russian nation is not defined by the borders of the Russian Federation. It's defined by Russian people, people who have shared culture, language, history, religion. His job is to protect them. Never again will they be abandoned. That's the essence of his 2005 speech, where he said one of the greatest tragedies in the last century was the end of the Soviet Union. Everybody picked up on that and said, oh, he wants to bring the Soviet Union back. You don't know Vladimir Putin very well if you think he wants to bring the Soviet Union back. Because the next sentence said it all, because overnight, tens of millions of Russians became homeless. And as the Russian president, he can't accept that. There has to be a home for the Russian people. They have to be secured. They have to be safe. And right now, if you're a Russian living in Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, you're not safe. You're not secure. So the Russian president's going to take care of them. Listen to the president. He made it quite clear what's going to happen. Now, people say, well, where's the military in all this? I don't know, guys. Again, why don't you just take a look at what's happened? Phase one, I already told you about phase one. It's not a debate anymore. We know what it was. 200,000 men trying to put short-term pressure on the Kiev government to get them to the negotiating table to bring an end to this conflict on terms acceptable to Russia. No membership in NATO, independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, Crimea, Russia forever. But there was nothing in that 1 April peace treaty that talked about Kherson and Zaporizhia. That territory would have been given back to Ukraine, just like the Russians voluntarily evacuated from Kiev, Sumy, and in other areas. They had no intention of stealing this Ukrainian territory. But then we go into phase two, which was that medium-sized war of attrition that was going, which Russia won, by the way. For all the corruption and all the stuff that everybody's talking about, Russia won that war. God, how did they win? Look at the damn casualties. One of the key aspects of war is to destroy your enemy. And Russia ground the Ukrainians down. How do you think you get the 350,000 dead, which is probably the number that we're looking at in terms of Ukrainian casualties? How do you get there? By killing them. And who was killing them? The Russian soldiers. Where? Right there on the Eastern Front. Right there on the Eastern Front. From May until August, there was this awful war of attrition that the Russians were winning. They were grinding the Ukrainian military down. And the only reason why the Ukrainian military was able to recover is because they received tens of billions of dollars worth of training, intelligence support, operational support, equipment that allowed them to reconstitute a military, which then exploited the fact that because Russia hadn't gone to a war footing, they could attack the extended flanks in Kharkov and in Kherson. And they did. And the Russians had to consolidate on a new defensive line. In the process, that Ukrainian force that was built up was wiped out. And now what the Russians did is they mobilized in September. Mobilized. Now, I don't know what people think mobilize means. It's not an instantaneous event. You actually have to get the guys organized. You have to identify them, put them through a processing thing, give them uniforms and stuff, and send them off for training. Now, about 80,000 of those guys received sort of refresher training because they had relevant military skills because they weren't out for a long time, and they were sent to the front to help strengthen the front line so that never again the Ukrainians would find overextended defenses. This would be doctrinal defenses in terms of proper concentration of forces on the front line with second and third lines of defense. Read Russian doctrine, people. Read it. I have. That's what it calls for. Strong points, cauldrons, fire cauldrons, sufficient artillery, so that you break up the attacks. They get in there, they get caught up in the second line of defense, they get blown to hell, they all die. That's what's been going on. All you big arrow proponents. What do you think the Ukrainians have been doing from, say, October until January? They've been launching attacks that have been failing. They've been hitting Russian defenses, and they're getting crushed. Where's the Russian offense? Right there, guys. The Russians are fighting a war. Look at the Russian casualty lists, and you'll understand they're fighting a war because Russia's losing a lot of guys. This isn't a Sitzkrieg of 1939. This is an active war of a scope and scale unimaginable to anybody. I didn't make that term up. That's Lieutenant General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces and NATO forces, speaking in Sweden in January. He said NATO couldn't imagine what the size of this conflict, the lethality of this conflict, which means NATO is not trained for it, prepared for it, can't fight it. That's what he was saying. And one of the main aspects of that is artillery. The role of artillery in this thing, the amount of ammunition being fired is just mind-boggling. NATO doesn't have that ammunition. And guess what? Ukraine's going to run out of ammunition this summer. Oh, Scott, how do you know that? Jan Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said so. He said there's nothing NATO can do to reverse that. It's a big problem that Ukraine's going to have to deal with. Well, how do you deal with an artillery-driven war when you run out of artillery ammunition? You die, you lose. And that's what people were saying. Where's the offense? I just told you, guys, war is about attriting the enemy's capabilities down. You don't have to do that big arrow. You do that by maintaining constant military pressure on them, and you kill their soldiers at a rate greater than they kill your soldiers, and you get them to expend their resources, either by having them use them or lose them. And right now, why do you think Ukraine is out there begging for more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition? Because they don't have it. Why don't they have it? Because the Russians have been destroying it. That means Russia has never stopped on the attack. Everybody wants this great drive. Well, it takes time to develop, and it takes resources. If you look at the Ministry of Defense, they've been telling you all along that there are specific units that are organized to carry so-called breakthrough or breakout operations. And they're training right now, doing combined arms, maneuver warfare in an environment that's designed to replicate the reality of the Ukrainian battlefield. They're training for war, people. You sort of want your units, they're going to be engaged in this kind of operation, to be well trained, and it takes time. Thank God the Russian military didn't bow to the pressure of the concerned population and take untrained units, put them on the front line, and get them slaughtered. Instead, what the Russians are doing is the hard, bloody business of war. They are maintaining a constant pressure on the battlefield, not just in Bakhmut, which is getting a lot of attention, but in Zaporizhia and Uladar up near Limon. There's all these offensives taking place. And what's happening is Ukrainians have to disperse their reserves, peter them out. The Russians are shaping the battlefield to their advantage so that when these units finish training and they come to the battlefield, there will be opportunities for them to exploit. That's what's going on. It's called war, and Russia's winning this war. I don't know what people want. Do you really want the Russians to draw a giant big arrow towards Kiev, take these units, throw them in there? You know, they did that in the Second World War. We can talk about Operation Bagration all we want. We can talk about the destruction of Army Group Center, and everybody focuses on the German casualties. Look at the Soviet casualties. Hundreds of thousands of dead men, hundreds of thousands of dead, millions of wounded, thousands of tanks lost in a victory, because that kind of big arrow war is expensive. Russia doesn't want to do that. They don't need to do that. They're winning right now. Just let the military do what it's doing. Have patience. The Russians have never looked to a calendar. I remember back in the spring, Russia's got to take Mariupol by Victory Day. Who the hell came up with that? Did Putin say that? Did the general staff say that? Did anybody? It was social media. It was people who aren't friends of Russia saying this because they're trying to put an artificial constraint on a military campaign that's not defined by the calendar but by battlefield results. And right now, the Russians are getting the battlefield results they need to get to win. They're grinding the Ukrainians down to nothing. The Ukrainians are. Why is Ukrainian mobilization consist of guys going around and kidnapping people? Because they're desperate. Why are they running around begging for more tanks and artillery? They're desperate. Why are they desperate? Because the Russian military is doing its job in creating desperation by grinding the Ukrainians down on the battlefield. That's what's happening.